The evening commute. The city was alive with the hum of evening activity. Streetlights flickered on, casting long, restless shadows on the bustling sidewalks. Cars honked impatiently in congested lanes, and the acrid scent of exhaust mixed with the crispness of early autumn. Among the chaos, Shayla Washington stood at the corner of the bus stop, her arms folded protectively over her pregnant belly. 7 months along and counting, her world was a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Shayla's day at the community center had been long but fulfilling. As a social worker, she spent her time advocating for disadvantaged families, teaching children, and lending a hand wherever needed. Today had been particularly trying. A new family had arrived, displaced and overwhelmed, their stories of hardship gripping Shayla's heart. She had spent hours helping them fill out forms, navigating the labyrinth of social services, and reassuring the young mother that brighter days were ahead. But now, her own fatigue was beginning to weigh her down. The ache in her back and feet seemed amplified with every passing moment. She shifted her weight, hoping the city bus would arrive sooner rather than later. The stop was crowded tonight. A mix of strangers milled around, their expressions ranging from weariness to irritation. The after-work rush painted the atmosphere with impatience as people fidgeted, checked their phones, or avoided eye contact altogether. Among them, Shayla spotted a middle-aged man in a rumpled business suit. His stance exuded irritation, and his expression was locked in a permanent scowl. She noticed how he checked his watch every 30 seconds, muttering under his breath about lateness. It was clear he didn't want to be there. Jared Thompson, a mid-level executive at an advertising firm, was having what he would later refer to as the worst day of his life. His Mercedes had broken down on the way to an important meeting, forcing him to rely on the very public transit system he often dismissed as beneath him. Jared prided himself on his success, a man who had risen through the ranks with sheer determination, or so he liked to think. Today, though, nothing seemed to be going his way. As Jared glared at the arriving bus in the distance, Shayla focused on calming herself. The baby had been particularly active this evening, tiny kicks reminding her that the long hours she kept were taking their toll. She rubbed her belly in soothing circles, offering a smile to the life growing inside her. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, and the crowd surged forward. Shayla waited patiently, letting others board ahead of her. Jared, however, pushed past without a second thought, muttering about some of us having places to be. Shayla followed the flow of passengers onto the bus, her eyes scanning the crowded seats. A few rows ahead, Jared had already claimed a window seat. His briefcase occupied the seat next to him, creating an unmistakable barrier. As the bus lurched forward, the only available seats quickly disappeared. Taking a deep breath, Shayla approached Jared's row. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Would you mind if I sat here?" Jared barely looked up from his phone. His reply was curt, dismissive. "Find another seat." Shayla hesitated, surprised by the hostility. "There aren't any other seats left," she said, gesturing around. "I'm pregnant and standing for the ride." "Not my problem," Jared cut her off, his tone sharp. "You should have planned better." The words stung. Shayla's cheeks burned as a wave of embarrassment washed over her. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, a silent shield against the callousness of Jared's response. For a moment, she considered pressing the issue, but the look on Jared's face, a mix of irritation and indifference, told her it was futile. Shayla stepped back into the aisle, gripping the overhead rail for balance as the bus swayed and lurched through traffic. Her tired body screamed in protest, but she stayed silent, unwilling to draw more attention to herself. The exchange hadn't gone unnoticed. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. An older man with a weathered face and a dog-eared paperback frowned deeply, while a young woman with bright blue hair whispered to her friend, her eyes darting between Shayla and Jared. Despite the tension in the air, no one spoke up. In the quiet, Shayla felt the weight of the moment press down on her. She thought of all the small indignities she had faced as a black woman in the city, dismissive glances, unspoken biases, and now this. The injustice of it all bubbled beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. As the bus approached the next stop, a tall figure near the back stood. His uniform was crisp, and his posture spoke of discipline. Ethan Morales, a young Army sergeant returning from leave, had been watching the interaction from his seat. His sharp eyes took in Jared's arrogance, Shayla's quiet endurance, and the collective silence of the other passengers. Ethan moved down the aisle, each step deliberate. The bus seemed to hold its breath as he stopped beside Jared. "What's the problem here?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but commanding. Jared glanced up, his irritation flaring again. "There's no problem," he said dismissively. "Mind your business." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "That's funny," he replied, gesturing toward Shayla. "Because it looks like there's a seat here that someone needs, and you're blocking it for no good reason." The bus grew even quieter, the tension palpable. All eyes were on the unfolding confrontation. Shayla felt her heart race, a mix of anxiety and gratitude surging within her. Jared scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "I pay my taxes, just like everyone else. If I want to sit here, I will. Who do you think you are, trying to tell me what to do?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm someone who believes in basic decency," he said, his tone steady. "And I don't think you've earned the right to act like this. Now, move your bag." Jared's face flushed with anger, but Ethan's calm resolve was unshakable. The standoff continued, and the bus's collective discomfort reached its peak. This was no ordinary commute, and the moments to come would shape not just Shayla's evening, but the lives of everyone on that bus. The confrontation. The bus continued its jerky progress through the city streets, the hum of the engine and the occasional squeal of brakes providing a tense backdrop to the standoff unfolding inside. Jared glared up at Ethan, his pride and anger clashing visibly across his face. The passengers around them remained frozen in uneasy silence, their gazes darting between the two men and Shayla, who clung to the rail just a few steps away. Jared's voice was sharp as he leaned back in his seat. "Look," he said, with a forced calmness that barely concealed his frustration. "I don't know who you think you are, but I don't have to justify myself to you or anyone else. If she's uncomfortable, that's not my problem." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he tilted his head toward Shayla, who was swaying slightly as the bus hit a pothole. "That woman is pregnant," he said, his tone measured but firm. "She's carrying life, and she's visibly tired. You're sitting there, taking up 2 seats because of your briefcase. So yeah, it is your problem. It's called being a decent human being." The quiet strength of Ethan's words seemed to reverberate through the bus. Even the passengers who had been silently averting their eyes shifted uncomfortably, their guilt creeping into their expressions. Jared, however, was not one to back down easily. His face hardened, and his tone turned defensive. "Oh, now you're the morality police." Jared shot back, crossing his arms. "I don't care what you think is decent. I've had a long day too. My car broke down, my meeting got canceled, and I'm not about to give up my seat because someone else couldn't plan ahead." The words hung in the air like a slap, sharp and stinging. Shayla's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but before she could respond, Ethan spoke again. "Life's full of bad days," Ethan said evenly, his gaze unwavering. "But the kind of day you've had doesn't give you the right to make someone else's harder. It's not about planning. It's about respect." Jared let out a humorless laugh. "Respect? Don't lecture me about respect. I've worked for everything I have. I didn't get handouts, and I don't owe anyone a thing." He jabbed a finger toward Shayla, his voice rising. "Maybe if people like her worked a little harder." "Enough," Ethan interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp as a blade. The command in his tone silenced Jared mid-sentence and sent a shiver through the bus. Ethan took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Jared. His voice softened but carried an unmistakable edge. "You don't know her, and you have no right to make assumptions about her life or her work. What you're doing right now says a lot more about you than it ever could about her." Jared shifted uncomfortably, but his pride wouldn't let him relent. He folded his arms across his chest, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You think you're some kind of hero?" He sneered. "What gives you the right to tell me what to do? You're just another passenger on this bus, just like me." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I'm not here to be a hero," he said simply. "But I've worn this uniform long enough to know that standing by and doing nothing is never the right choice. You might think your actions don't matter, but they do. Every choice we make ripples out, affecting people in ways we don't even realize." The weight of Ethan's words settled over the bus, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Some passengers began to nod subtly, their expressions softening with recognition of the truth in his statement. Even Shayla, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, felt a surge of gratitude and hope. From the back of the bus, a soft voice broke the tension. "He's right, you know." All heads turned toward the elderly man with the paperback. George closed his book, his weathered hands resting on the cover as he looked at Jared. His voice was calm but carried the wisdom of a lifetime. "I've seen men like you before," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Too proud to admit when they're wrong. But let me tell you something, son. There's no shame in doing the right thing. The only shame is in refusing to." Jared's jaw tightened, but George wasn't finished. "You think this seat is just yours because you got here first. That's not how it works, not in a community. We take care of each other, or we fall apart. And right now, you're the one falling apart." A murmur of agreement rippled through the bus. Linda, the middle-aged woman who had been watching silently, stood up. "He's right," she said, her voice steady. "I've been where she is, pregnant, exhausted, and just trying to get through the day. You don't have to give up much to make someone else's life a little easier." Even Zoe, the blue-haired teenager, chimed in. "Come on, dude," she said, her tone tinged with exasperation. "It's just a seat. Don't be that guy." Jared's face flushed deep red as the passengers' voices began to build, their collective disapproval growing louder. He looked around, realizing that the tide had turned against him. For the first time, he seemed genuinely unsure of himself. Shayla watched the scene unfold, her emotions swirling. She hadn't expected anyone to come to her defense, let alone so many strangers. The kindness and solidarity of the other passengers were overwhelming, and for the first time that evening, she felt a flicker of hope. Finally, Jared let out a frustrated sigh. He grabbed his briefcase and stood, glaring at Ethan as he stepped aside to let Shayla take the seat. "Fine," he muttered. "Have it your way." Shayla hesitated, but Ethan gave her a reassuring nod. "Go ahead," he said gently. "You've earned this." With a small, grateful smile, Shayla lowered herself into the seat, her body instantly relaxing as the strain of standing was lifted. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan gave a small nod and returned to his seat. The passengers around Shayla exchanged warm smiles, some offering quiet words of encouragement. Jared, meanwhile, stood in the aisle, his shoulders tense and his face a mask of barely contained fury. As the bus rolled on, the mood began to shift. Conversations resumed, and the collective tension began to dissolve. But the impact of the confrontation lingered, a reminder to everyone on board of the power of a single act of kindness and the courage it sometimes takes to stand up for what's right. For Jared, however, the evening was far from over. What he didn't realize was that the ripples of this moment would follow him long after he stepped off the bus, forcing him to confront not just his actions, but the very foundations of who he believed himself to be. Ripples of accountability. Jared disembarked from the bus 2 stops later, his steps heavy and his face a mask of simmering anger and shame. The eyes of every passenger had followed him as he walked down the aisle, and he could still feel the weight of their judgment pressing on him. The city lights blurred in his peripheral vision as he trudged through the streets, replaying the confrontation over and over in his mind. Who do they think they are? He muttered under his breath, gripping the strap of his briefcase tightly. His thoughts churned with indignation. That soldier thinks he's some kind of saint. And those passengers, acting like they're better than me. Hypocrites. Despite his defiance, a nagging doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Jared had always prided himself on being in control, on projecting an image of success and authority. But tonight, that image had been shattered, not just in front of strangers, but in front of himself. As much as he tried to blame others, he couldn't escape the echo of Ethan's words. Your comfort doesn't outweigh her need. When Jared finally reached his apartment, the silence hit him like a wave. The sleek, minimalist space, once a symbol of his success, now felt cold and empty. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than usual, each second dragging out his unease. He tossed his briefcase onto the couch and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as his hands trembled ever so slightly. For a moment, he considered brushing the evening off entirely. He could forget about it, bury the memory in the noise of his busy schedule. But as he sat down, the events of the evening refused to fade. The image of Shayla standing in the aisle, her hand protectively cradling her belly, played in his mind like a haunting refrain. Her quiet endurance had been a stark contrast to his own outburst, and it unsettled him in ways he didn't want to admit. Jared leaned back, closing his eyes. The faces of the other passengers surfaced in his memory. The elderly man who had called him out, the woman who had given up her seat, the blue-haired teenager with her bold glare. And then there was Ethan, the soldier whose calm yet firm demeanor had cut through Jared's defenses like a scalpel. Why couldn't they just leave it alone? Jared muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, he knew the answer. They hadn't left it alone because he'd been wrong, and they had seen through his bluster to the man he didn't want to admit he was. The next morning, Jared arrived at the office, determined to put the incident behind him. He straightened his tie, plastered on his practiced smile, and strode through the sleek glass doors of his advertising firm. The familiar hum of keyboards and the low murmur of conversations greeted him, and for a moment, he felt a sense of normalcy. But as he passed his colleagues, he noticed something was off. The usual smiles and greetings were absent. Instead, there were furtive glances, hushed whispers, and quick averted gazes. Jared's brow furrowed as he reached his office, closing the door behind him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His assistant, Sarah, appeared at the door moments later, her expression unusually tense. "Mr. Thompson," she said, hesitating. "Mr. Coleman wants to see you in the conference room. He says it's urgent." Jared's stomach sank. Mr. Coleman, the CEO of the firm, rarely called meetings like this, especially not with such short notice. Trying to maintain his composure, Jared nodded. "I'll be right there," he said, straightening his suit jacket. As he made his way to the conference room, the unease grew. The whispers seemed louder now, and Jared caught snippets of conversations that stopped abruptly as he approached. By the time he reached the door, his palms were slick with sweat. When he stepped inside, the atmosphere hit him like a punch. The entire senior staff was gathered, their faces a mixture of discomfort and disapproval. At the head of the table stood Mr. Coleman, a towering figure with an imposing presence, and beside him, to Jared's shock, stood Ethan, the soldier from the bus. Jared froze, his heart pounding. What's this about?" he stammered, his voice faltering. Mr. Coleman's expression was grim. "Take a seat, Jared," he said, his voice cold. "We need to have a serious discussion." Jared sat, his mind racing. The silence in the room was suffocating as Mr. Coleman picked up a remote and turned on the large screen at the end of the table. Jared's heart sank as a video began to play, a video of the confrontation on the bus. The recording, taken by a passenger with a smartphone, captured everything. Jared's dismissive refusal to give up his seat, Shayla's quiet dignity, and Ethan's sharp rebuke. The room was silent as the video played, but Jared could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him. When the video ended, Mr. Coleman turned to Jared, his expression unreadable. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jared struggled to find words. It was taken out of context. He began weakly. "I had a bad day. My car broke down, and—" "Enough," Mr. Coleman interrupted, his voice cutting through Jared's excuses like a knife. "Bad days don't excuse behavior like that. You represented not just yourself but this company. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? How it makes you look?" Jared's face burned with humiliation. "I didn't know it was being recorded," he muttered, instantly regretting the words as they left his mouth. "That's your concern?" Mr. Coleman asked, his tone incredulous. "Not the fact that you treated another human being with such blatant disregard. Not the fact that you showed a complete lack of empathy and professionalism." Ethan, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "It's not about the recording," he said calmly. "It's about the choices we make when we think no one is watching. You showed everyone on that bus, and now everyone in this room, who you really are." Jared couldn't meet Ethan's gaze. The soldier's words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. The silence that followed was deafening. Jared's colleagues exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disappointment and unease. Mr. Coleman let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. "Jared," he said finally, "we value integrity in this company. And right now, I don't see that in you." Jared's heart sank. He knew what was coming. "We're placing you on indefinite leave," Mr. Coleman continued. "Effective immediately. Use this time to reflect on your actions and decide what kind of person you want to be. Because if this is who you are, there's no place for you here." The words hit Jared like a blow. He wanted to argue, to plead his case, but the looks on the faces around him told him it was useless. Slowly, he stood, his legs shaky, and left the room without a word. As the door closed behind him, the weight of his actions finally began to sink in. For the first time, Jared felt not just anger or embarrassment, but something deeper, regret, reckoning, and reflection. Jared sat alone in his apartment that evening, the lights dim, his untouched dinner growing cold on the table. The events of the past 24 hours played on a loop in his mind, each memory sharper and more damning than the last. The confrontation on the bus, the scathing words from Ethan, and finally, the judgment delivered by Mr. Coleman in the conference room. All of it bore down on him like an unbearable weight. He had been placed on indefinite leave, a polite way of saying he was teetering on the edge of being fired. The knowledge stung, but what hurt more was the realization that his colleagues, people who had once respected him, now saw him as something else, an arrogant, selfish man who had failed a simple test of decency. The video from the bus had already begun to circulate online. A quick search on social media revealed it had been shared dozens of times, accompanied by captions like, "Entitled businessman refuses to give seat to pregnant woman," and "When a soldier teaches you what respect looks like." The comments were even worse. Strangers picked apart his appearance, his behavior, and his words with ruthless precision. At first, Jared had tried to tell himself it didn't matter. They didn't know him. But the more he read, the more he realized the person they were describing wasn't entirely a stranger. It was him. The following morning, Jared awoke after a restless night, his mind still buzzing with the fallout of his actions. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to go, no meetings to attend, no schedule to follow. The emptiness of his day stretched before him like a chasm. He decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air might clear his head. The city seemed quieter than usual, or maybe it was just his perception. As he passed familiar landmarks, his favorite coffee shop, the park where he used to jog, he felt an unfamiliar sense of disconnection, as though he didn't belong anymore. Jared's steps eventually brought him to the community center where Shayla worked. He hadn't consciously planned to come here, but now that he was standing in front of the modest brick building, he felt a pull to go inside. The lobby was bustling with activity. Children ran through the space, their laughter mingling with the low hum of adult conversations. Volunteers bustled about, carrying supplies and chatting with parents. Jared stood awkwardly near the entrance, unsure of what he was doing there. A receptionist noticed him and approached with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. Jared hesitated. I was wondering if Shayla Washington is here," he said, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly. "She's with the children right now," she said, "but I can let her know someone's here to see her. May I ask your name?" Jared hesitated again, then finally said, "It's Jared Thompson." The receptionist nodded and disappeared into a hallway. Jared stood there, fidgeting with the strap of his bag and feeling increasingly out of place. This wasn't his world. He belonged in boardrooms, not community centers. But the memory of Shayla's quiet resilience on the bus wouldn't leave him. He needed to say something. He just didn't know what. After a few minutes, Shayla appeared in the hallway. She was dressed casually, her expression guarded as she approached him. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Jared nodded, suddenly feeling exposed under her gaze. Yes. I wanted to apologize," he said haltingly. The words felt clumsy in his mouth, but he pushed forward. "For how I treated you on the bus. It was wrong. I was wrong." Shayla studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "You've come all the way here to say that?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Yes," Jared said, his voice firmer now. "I've been thinking about it a lot. About how I acted. And seeing you standing there, pregnant and tired, and knowing I could have done something so simple to help and chose not to. I can't justify it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I regret it." Shayla's expression softened slightly, but she remained composed. "It's not about forgiveness," she said after a moment. "It's about growth. If you've realized you were wrong, and you're willing to change, that's what matters. But words aren't enough. What are you going to do about it?" Jared blinked, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know," he admitted. "But I want to find a way to make it right." Shayla nodded. "That's a start," she said. "If you're serious, there's plenty of work to be done. People here could always use a hand. It's not glamorous or easy, but it's real." Jared swallowed hard. "You mean volunteer here?" "Why not?" Shayla said, raising an eyebrow. "If you're looking for a way to understand what it means to step outside of yourself and help others, this is as good a place as any." Jared hesitated. He had never considered himself the type to volunteer. His world had always been one of polished offices, high-powered meetings, and personal ambition. But standing here, in the midst of this vibrant, imperfect, and human space, he felt something shift inside him. "I'll do it," he said finally, surprising himself as much as her. "Where do I start?" Over the following weeks, Jared began volunteering at the community center. At first, he felt out of place among the staff and the families they served. He struggled with tasks that seemed simple to others, stacking supplies, organizing events, even just listening without judgment. But Shayla and the other workers were patient, guiding him as he fumbled his way through. For the first time in years, Jared was in an environment where his title and wealth meant nothing. He was just another pair of hands, another face in the crowd. It was humbling and, in some ways, liberating. One day, as Jared helped a young boy with his homework, he felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see a girl with pigtails and a shy smile holding a crayon drawing. "This is you," she said, holding up the picture. Jared stared at the drawing. It was crude but unmistakable, a figure in a suit surrounded by children, a faint smile on his face. For the first time in weeks, Jared felt a genuine smile tug at his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "I'll treasure it." The girl beamed and ran off, leaving Jared alone with the picture. He stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about himself. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Jared didn't realize it yet, but this small act of service marked the beginning of a transformation, one that would ripple outward, changing not only his life, but the lives of those around him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. A changed man in a changing world. Weeks turned into months, and Jared's routine at the community center began to feel more natural than the sterile, high-powered life he had once cherished. Each morning, he found himself eagerly walking through the same bustling streets that had once felt foreign and uncomfortable. The faint smell of fresh pastries from a nearby bakery, the chatter of children on their way to school, and the hum of city life now seemed less like an intrusion and more like a symphony. Jared's transformation wasn't immediate. At first, his volunteering was marked by self-consciousness and awkwardness. He was a man who had spent years living by schedules, deadlines, and profit margins. The unstructured and emotionally demanding nature of the community center had been a culture shock. But gradually, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. The children's laughter, the resilience of the families, and the unwavering dedication of the staff began to seep into the cracks. One afternoon, Jared found himself working with a group of teenagers, helping them prepare for a debate competition. The topic was empathy and responsibility in modern society, and the irony wasn't lost on him. He watched as the teens passionately argued their points, their words filled with the idealism of youth. One boy in particular, Marcus, caught Jared's attention. Marcus had a sharp wit and a natural charisma that reminded Jared of his younger self, except Marcus's arguments were fueled by compassion rather than ambition. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood tall and said, "Empathy isn't just feeling sorry for someone. It's understanding their struggles and realizing you're part of the solution. Responsibility means stepping up, even when it's inconvenient, because that's what makes us human." The words struck a chord in Jared. They echoed something Ethan had said on the bus, something Jared had dismissed at the time. Every choice we make ripples out, affecting people in ways we don't even realize. Jared felt an unfamiliar lump in his throat as he clapped for Marcus's speech. Later that evening, Jared stayed late at the community center to help Shayla organize a fundraiser. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the soft clinking of coffee cups. Shayla's presence, as always, was steady and grounding. "You've come a long way," Shayla said, breaking the silence. Her tone was warm but measured, as though she were assessing a student who had finally begun to understand the lesson. Jared glanced up from the stack of flyers he was sorting. "Thanks," he said, his voice tinged with humility. "I still feel like I have a lot to learn." Shayla nodded. "That's the point, isn't it? Growth doesn't stop just because we've made progress." Jared hesitated, then asked, "Why did you give me a chance? After what happened on the bus, I wouldn't have blamed you for wanting nothing to do with me." Shayla leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Because I've seen what bitterness does to people. It eats them up from the inside. I didn't want to carry that weight. And honestly, I hoped you'd prove me wrong. I'm glad you did." Her words carried a kindness that Jared hadn't encountered in years, and it humbled him further. He realized how rare it was for someone to extend grace in the face of hurt. It was a lesson he vowed to carry forward. As Jared immersed himself deeper into the community center's work, he began noticing the gaps in resources and support that families struggled with daily. From limited access to education and health care to food insecurity, the challenges these families faced were staggering. For the first time, Jared saw the systemic inequalities that he had previously ignored or dismissed as someone else's problem. One evening, as he was helping a single mother named Maria sort through housing applications, he felt a surge of frustration. The forms were unnecessarily complex, the requirements almost impossible for someone working multiple jobs to meet. Maria's weariness was palpable, but so was her determination. "Why does it have to be this hard?" Jared asked aloud, more to himself than to her. Maria gave him a small, tired smile. "Because people like me don't make the rules," she said simply. "But we keep going. We have to." Her words stayed with Jared long after Maria left. That night, he sat in his apartment and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him was different now, not just because he was volunteering, but because he was beginning to understand. The privilege he had taken for granted was a currency that others could only dream of possessing, and for the first time, he wanted to use it for something other than himself. Determined to make a more substantial impact, Jared began leveraging his professional skills and connections. He reached out to colleagues, former clients, and business contacts, pitching them on the idea of supporting the community center. His approach was strategic but heartfelt, and slowly, donations started pouring in. He also began organizing workshops for the center's families, teaching financial literacy, job interview skills, and resume writing. It was a small contribution, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by the center, having heard about Jared's involvement. The soldier greeted Jared with a firm handshake and a nod of approval. "I'll admit," Ethan said, leaning against a table as they talked, "I didn't think you'd take the lessons from that bus ride to heart, but you've proven me wrong." Jared gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "I had a lot to make up for it," he said. "Still do." Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. "The important thing is you're doing it. That's more than most people can say." Their conversation was brief, but it left Jared with a renewed sense of determination. He realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a better future. One day, Shayla approached Jared with a folder in hand. "You should see this," she said, handing it to him. Inside was a proposal for a new program at the center, one that would focus on mentoring youth and helping them prepare for college and careers. The proposal was ambitious, requiring funding and coordination that the center didn't currently have. "I think you're the right person to lead this," Shayla said, her tone steady. Jared blinked, taken aback. "Me? Why?" "Because you've lived both sides," Shayla said simply. "You understand what it means to struggle now, but you also know how to navigate the world of privilege and power. That's a rare perspective." Jared stared at the folder, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. He hadn't realized how much he'd changed until this moment, when someone believed in him enough to entrust him with something so significant. He looked up at Shayla, his jaw set with determination. "I'll do it," he said. Shayla smiled. "I know you will." As the program took shape, Jared poured his energy into it. He worked long hours, often staying late at the center to ensure everything was running smoothly. He mentored teens, secured partnerships with local businesses, and even lobbied city officials for additional funding. The work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. For the first time, Jared felt like he was building something meaningful, something that wasn't just for him. And in doing so, he began to heal not only the damage he had caused, but also the wounds he hadn't realized he carried. The ripples of his actions continued to spread, touching lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. But perhaps the greatest change was in Jared himself. He was no longer defined by the man he had been on that bus. He was becoming someone new, someone better. And for the first time, he felt proud of who he was. The ripple effect. Months later, the community center was buzzing with an energy Jared had come to love. The once cramped space had transformed into a vibrant hub of activity, thanks to the new programs and funding he had helped secure. Walls that were once bare now displayed colorful murals painted by the children, and a newly constructed classroom wing echoed with the sound of learning and laughter. Jared stood near the entrance, observing the scene with a quiet sense of pride. The mentorship program he had spearheaded was in full swing. Teens like Marcus, the sharp-witted debater, were now leading workshops for younger kids. Parents like Maria, who had once struggled with daunting bureaucracy, were finding steady footing thanks to new housing support initiatives. The center had become a lifeline for so many. And for Jared, it had become a home. Shayla approached him, her presence as grounding as ever. She was holding her newborn daughter, Amara, who gurgled happily in her arms. Jared smiled at the sight, his heart warming in a way that still surprised him. "How does it feel?" Shayla asked, her tone teasing but warm. "Being the unofficial hero of the community center." Jared chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm no hero," he said. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time." "You're doing more than that," Shayla said, her gaze steady. "You've created something that's changing lives, mine included." Jared glanced at Amara, her tiny hand grasping one of Shayla's fingers. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "She's lucky to have you." "And lucky to have a community like this," Shayla added. "You helped build that, Jared. Don't downplay it." Jared nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. The man who had once clung to arrogance and entitlement now felt humbled by the simple act of being part of something larger than himself. That evening, the center hosted its first-ever community night, an event celebrating the achievements of its members. Families arrived dressed in their best, kids darted around excitedly, and tables overflowed with food donated by local businesses. Jared, dressed in a casual blazer and slacks, mingled with the crowd, shaking hands and listening to stories. The highlight of the night was the program's first cohort of high school seniors, who were being honored for their college acceptances and scholarships. Jared had spent hours coaching these teens, helping them navigate application processes and personal statements. Seeing them stand on the small stage, their faces alight with pride, brought tears to his eyes. Marcus, the charismatic teen who had inspired Jared with his debate skills, took the microphone. "This center gave me more than just a place to hang out," he said, his voice steady and confident. "It gave me hope. It gave me people who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And a lot of that is because of Mr. Thompson." The crowd applauded, and Jared felt a lump rise in his throat. Marcus turned to him, his expression sincere. "You didn't just teach us skills," Marcus said. "You taught us how to believe in ourselves. Thank you." The applause grew louder, and Jared, uncharacteristically shy, gave a small wave. It was a moment he would never forget, a moment that marked how far he had come. As the event wound down, Jared found himself alone on the center's small patio, the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the open door. The night sky was clear, the stars shining brighter than he remembered. Ethan stepped outside, his sharp military posture softened by a warm smile. "I heard about the event and thought I'd stop by," he said, extending a hand. Jared shook it firmly. "Glad you're here," he said. "This place owes a lot to you, whether you realize it or not." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Me? I didn't do much. You're the one who put in the work." Jared leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful. "You did more than you think," he said. "That night on the bus, you didn't just stand up for Shayla. You stood up for me, in a way. You showed me who I was, and who I could be." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "That's the thing about moments like that," he said. "They're not just about the people directly involved. They ripple out. You've taken that ripple and turned it into something bigger. That's on you, Jared." Jared smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that felt like a rare gift. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Over the following weeks, Jared's story began to spread beyond the community center. The video of his confrontation on the bus, once a source of shame, was now part of a larger narrative, one of redemption, growth, and the power of change. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting Jared's work at the center and the transformative impact it had on the community. Soon, businesses and donors began reaching out, inspired by the center's mission. With this new wave of support, the programs expanded, touching even more lives. Jared found himself at the forefront of something he had never envisioned, a movement rooted in compassion and action. One day, Jared received an email from a familiar name, Mr. Coleman. The CEO had seen the news coverage and was reaching out to commend Jared for his work. "I underestimated you," the email read. "You've shown what true leadership looks like. If you're ever ready to return to the firm, the door is open." Jared stared at the message for a long time before closing his laptop. He didn't need to return. He had already found his purpose. On a quiet Sunday morning, Jared returned to the bus route where his journey had begun. He boarded the same bus, now carrying a box of flyers for the community center. As he found a seat, he looked around, noticing the same mix of tired faces, hurried commuters, and quiet moments of humanity. When an elderly woman boarded a few stops later, Jared stood immediately, offering his seat with a warm smile. She hesitated, then accepted with a nod of thanks. As the bus rolled through the city, Jared stared out the window, his heart full. The man who had once refused to stand was now unrecognizable to the man he had become. The ripples of that night had carried him farther than he ever imagined, and he was ready to keep going, one act of kindness at a time. The legacy of change. As the bus made its way through the bustling streets, Jared couldn't help but reflect on how this very route had once symbolized a confrontation that shattered his carefully constructed world. Now it felt like a full circle moment, a chance to reclaim that day and define it not as a moment of failure, but as the spark of a greater journey. The elderly woman in the seat he had given up glanced at him with curiosity. "You seem familiar," she said, her voice soft, but sharp with observation. "Have we met before?" Jared hesitated, then offered a small smile. "Maybe. I used to take this bus route once. It wasn't my finest hour." The woman tilted her head. "Ah," she said knowingly. "You're the man from that video, aren't you? The one who—" She trailed off, not wanting to embarrass him. "I am," Jared admitted, his tone even. "But I'd like to think I've grown since then." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." That evening, Jared sat on the community center's patio, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Shayla joined him, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Amara was asleep in her stroller, her small breaths audible over the faint sounds of children playing in the distance. "You've come a long way, Jared," Shayla said, breaking the silence. "I don't think the man who got on that bus months ago could have imagined sitting here like this." Jared chuckled softly. "I couldn't have imagined it even a few weeks after. But I think I needed that wake-up call. I needed to be shaken out of the life I thought was enough." Shayla smiled. "It's not just about the wake-up call. It's about what you do with it. And you've done a lot." Jared looked out at the vibrant scene before him. Families were picking up their kids, teenagers were laughing as they walked home together, and volunteers were cleaning up after another successful day. This wasn't just a community center anymore. It was a testament to what could happen when people came together. In the weeks that followed, Jared continued to immerse himself in his work. The mentorship program expanded, and partnerships with local schools and businesses flourished. Jared became a familiar face not only at the center but in city meetings, advocating for policies that supported underserved communities. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. At a city awards ceremony, Jared was presented with a Community Hero Award, recognizing his contributions to the community center and his advocacy work. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, he spotted Shayla, Ethan, Marcus, and others from the center sitting in the audience, their faces beaming with pride. In his acceptance speech, Jared said, "This award isn't about me. It's about all of us. The people who stand up when it's uncomfortable, who fight for what's right even when it's inconvenient. We all have the power to make a difference, no matter where we start. I'm proof of that." The applause was thunderous, but what mattered most to Jared was the feeling of shared purpose that filled the room. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was the story of a community rising together. Months turned into years, and the community center became a model for others across the city. Jared continued to lead initiatives, mentor youth, and fight for systemic change. But he never forgot the moment that had set everything in motion. The day on the bus when a soldier, a young mother, and a group of strangers had shown him the truth about himself and the world around him. On the anniversary of that day, Jared returned to the bus stop where it all began. He carried no briefcase, no suit, just a stack of flyers for the center and a sense of quiet resolve. As the bus arrived, he stepped on board and found a seat near the back. This time, when a woman with a child boarded and looked around hesitantly, Jared didn't wait for her to ask. He stood immediately, gesturing to his seat with a warm smile. "Please," he said, "take my seat." The woman hesitated, then smiled back. "Thank you," she said, settling into the seat with her child on her lap. As Jared stood in the aisle, steadying himself against the sway of the bus, he realized something profound. The journey he had begun months ago wasn't about redemption or recognition. It was about becoming the person he had always hoped to be, the person who saw others, who cared, and who acted. The bus rumbled on, and Jared smiled to himself. The ripples of kindness were still spreading, touching lives in ways he might never fully see. And for the first time in his life, he felt at peace, not because he had reached an endpoint, but because he had learned to embrace the journey.